Season 1, Episode 1, Headcount Experts. I'm with Chris Mannion. Did I pronounce that right?
That's right. Yeah. Hey, everyone.
I'm Eric Guidice. We're the Headcount Experts. We're going to bring you 8 episodes. So Season 1, Q4 of 2026, when we're filming, is 8 episodes that span the entirety of closing out 2025 and setting 2026. If it hits, we'll do more next year. But this first episode is all about prepping for headcount season, which starting now, we're recording this on October 9th. So most folks are finishing up their 2025 hiring plan and getting ready for 2026, but that's what we're doing. And the nice thing about this podcast is we've done this before, internally, before solving this problem externally. So tell me a little bit, what's your background? Where'd you come from? What makes you a headcount expert?
Yeah, great question. I have to go back 7 years to when I first moved into the talent space, and maybe give a bit of context. So my background is not along the HR path or even the analytics path. It actually started in aerospace engineering. I was in the military. We did counter-piracy, counter-terrorism work out in the Middle East. A lot of that was actually just figuring out where to put the right things at the right time, which led me into supply chain after I left the military. But it was in 2018 when I was complaining so much about not being able to hire for my team that someone said, okay, well, go run a recruiting team and you can see how hard it actually is. And, as a cocky MBA, thought, yep, I'll come in, I'll fix this in 2 weeks, and then I'll get back to the business. And actually, I think everyone knows the end of that story. But it was actually going into that role. One of the teams I was leading was our campus recruiting team. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, how do we build a best-in-class campus program? And a big part of that is actually making sure that you can hire the best people, and the best people generally get snapped up in the fall. Now, we're talking about Q4 planning cycles. So 2020 cycle starts now, but if you're a campus recruiter, you already need to be on campus and closing candidates 2 weeks ago. So that kind of led to me just trying to figure out, how do we actually estimate how many hires we're going to need to make? How do we project forward? How can I take what I learned in supply chain and actually apply that? And it was actually by doing that we built a really great program. And then my role expanded. I started taking on more recruiting analytics. And then really since then, I've just been fascinated with the space. So, if you get this right, you can really up-level the team, up-level the organization. If you get it wrong, as we've seen over the last few years, you've got layoffs, you've got employer brand hits, you've got all the different things that go with it. So kind of a bit of a background, because mine's really a non-traditional path, but just for some context, I've been doing this for 7 years, and now lead a company where I actually help mid-stage companies who are growing or going through a lot of change to actually figure out how to solve this.
Yes. And I first of all, every background in TA is non-traditional, because there's no, to my knowledge, degree in recruiting that you can go get. So I took a more traditional path going into, an individual contributor recruiting route. I worked at startups like Sterling Backchecks, which was a background screening company, Travel Click, which was a PE-backed firm that had a big growth spurt in New York. Then I did it at Uber, I did it at Bird Scooters, I did it at Clutter, and packaged up all of those learnings and then sold it via Unicorn Talent, which, for those who don't know, is now a community where everything that I've learned in my TA career is now free, with the idea that there is no school for recruiting. So go learn from the mistakes and the learnings that I've made from working at these companies. But, I think what's interesting about this podcast is there's going to be something for everyone on it, right? If you're a beginner, you're going to, we've I'll speak for myself. You can admit this if you'd like, but to get to be an expert, I had to suck first. And so I had to learn through pain all of the different things that didn't work to now know what does work. And so if you're a beginner, that's what we want to share with you, is like, hey, here's what to avoid. Here's some basics that can get you there. If you're intermediate, you know what you're doing, you hold a high level role at somewhere like a Wayfair or an Uber or a wherever, we're going to show you some of the best practices that scale beyond just one company. So you might be solving some problems that seem odd to you. Like, I think every person in the provider space has that can't be how it works. And we want to kind of show you what the broader market is doing. And then, if you're advanced, if you're driving innovation in the space, one, we want to collaborate with you. So you'll see a landing page where you can go ask some questions or request to be on the podcast. Like, we want to talk with others in the future. But if you're advanced, then we're going to talk about some of these concepts and how AI is changing the market. And for headcount, and what I've seen in your tutorials, I'll let you plug the YouTube page in a little bit, is the headcount data set. Once you put all the data from these different systems and different users in one data lake, there's new information. There's new analytics that you can then use to either be more predictable about the future, drive accountability for the actions that are happening today. So there's all this different stuff that we want to explore. So I think there's something for everyone on the podcast, and whether or not you and I are the best hosts for it, we're going to find out. Like I said, S1E1, but
What's
you
the
and I have
benefit
done the
of
job
guest,
before,
right?
which I think is unique. And that's what I think I'd love to hear about. What was your first Q4 like? Like, we're getting into it right now, October 9th, which means people are finishing up 2025. That means hiring managers are requesting new things or backfills that they think are on the 2025 plan, but based on your experience that you had with campus, which is not unique to the, bigger markets, especially if you're in Europe, right? 90-day notice periods in some places, right? So like, how do you manage that? How do you group all the data together? But like, what was your first Q4 experience? Like, how did you tackle this the first time? What's something that you would want to share from that outside of your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think going into Q4 the first time, I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I totally sucked at it. I was fortunate that I was part of a really strong team. But I think you hit on a key point there of actually making sure that HR has the right data to go in and actually have these conversations, to have a seat at the table at the planning meeting, and not just get thrown a bunch of recs once the planning cycle is complete, and then realize that you're trying to fill 500 recs in the first month of the fiscal year when you only have recruiters for 50 recs a month. And so I think that was a really good learning curve for me. It was scary at first, going in and knowing that we had, within my team, we had 700 full-time recs to fill, another 800 kind of interns, because you're thinking 2 years ahead, and what does the growth trajectory look like? How many interns do you need in order to convert full-time hires 2 years from now? But also, how does that fit in with the overall picture? And one of the nuances of campus is that you're kind of going in, you already have a number of candidates already closed. So you're starting that budgeting process knowing that okay, if we need 200 entry-level people coming into the organization, we've already closed 100. What does that mean for the rest of the year? And it actually drove some interesting discussions, because for one of the first times we were actually starting with that kind of data and that projection. We actually had some pretty hot debates with the other recruiting leaders as to who should own different channels. And so I was trying to kind of learn on the fly, also trying to project knowledge and assume I knew what I was doing. I definitely didn't. I think in hindsight, I think going back and asking questions of the right people, I think would have been a kind of like a key recommendation I would have made to myself 7 years ago. Not just assuming that kind of everything because you've run one kind of analysis process, but actually learning from the other TA leaders who they had 15, 20 years experience each in the space, deep recruiting expertise. And I feel like I could have learned a lot more and actually built a plan collaboratively instead of coming in with my spreadsheet. They came in with their spreadsheets. They didn't talk to each other, and you've seen the chaos when everyone has their own baseline assumptions. None of it actually relates to finance. And then the business is kind of planning in a silo. And so I think just getting all the stakeholders together and going in with a more I think humble approach. With more of like discovery of like, okay, what do you want? Why do you want it? What is a reasonable timeline for you? And then do you understand the process of, if you want to hire 100 people in January, that means you've got to start recruiting for them in October if you've got a 3 months time to hire. And that means we've got to hire recruiters 3 months before that if you actually want to ramp the team in order to hit that kind of month one goal. I think once you start explaining that to business leaders who are generally smart people, but just not experts in the domain, they can actually start to get a grip of the kind of concept and the way that I did, coming from the business and actually learning the kind of the trade and the craft of recruiting, drinking from a fire hose for the first 9 to 9 months. I'm curious how that relates to your experience. You probably went into the Q4 planning cycle with a depth of experience, and what were some of the blind spots for you?
No, so you actually, I want to touch on a couple of things before we move into that. Is like, there's two main things that I heard from what you just talked about. Is one is campus has a context, right? It has a certain availability of candidate. It has a certain process that is very predictable given the unified nature of everyone going through a similar level role. There is, an availability of candidates. There's a predictable funnel conversion rate. There's a relatively low drop-off rate given the period between the offer and the start. And so when you plan for something that is like an intern level role, especially when you have a good brand name, there's a lot of statistics that you might carry to a different company. I see this a lot when big company workforce planners take on more scope of role and try to apply those same workforce concepts to a scale up. Is like they assume these good conversion rates or this good brand equity, but it might be for this new startup. And then compounded on top of that is your funnel metrics are, from what I understand, I'm not as in the space of the funnel as I used to be, is that AI is like cluttering the top of the funnel. And so you're going to have to assume this more process intensive kind of weeding out of folks should tools not be on the other side of that. So that's number one. Number two, you brought up two things that I thought, one, we integrate into Headcount 365 really well, which is how long does it take to hire someone? How long does it take for that person to quit and then start their job again? Another thing not integrated into Headcount 365 yet, and maybe we could build and release on Unicorn together, is the available interviewers for the process. For example, at Uber, we were hiring, I think I was doing somewhere between 10 and 20 hires per month of like high level folks, which was it was an insane scale. I would never recommend people target that. That being said, we would launch a city and someone would say like, oh, I need, 10 people, but they had 40 hours of work to do. They had to run a city, launch a city, and they had to interview. And if you just look at the conversion rate of how many people it takes to get into the funnel to produce an offer at the time you wanted it. We're not even talking about recruiting capacity. We're not talking about time to fill. Do you, interviewer, have the amount of time necessary? Even if I gave you perfect funnel conversion rates, you don't have the amount of time because it's 7 hours per interview. You have 40 hours a week. You need 3 interviews to get 1 offer. And we're talking ideal conversion rate. So, when you're looking at, for beginners, right? What you're going to find, what Chris and I have dealt with is that recruiting looks the same. It looks like an easy problem to solve. There's a supply, there's an output, there's a conversion, there's a time, and these metrics go very well into spreadsheets. But there's a nuance to recruiting that is the context of what you're filling plus these other inputs that are kind of hidden in this unified data lake between HR, finance, recruiting, hiring manager, candidates, right? There's all this information about how people interact with your business down to how if you do a fundraising announcement, if you're the new hot thing, if you have bad press cycle, there's all this stuff. So there's noise in the funnel. So for the new workforce planners, right? And I would apply a more broad standard and then hone in from there rather than assuming your existing conversion rates from another bigger brand company work in your larger scope role. I would incorporate other metrics to try to distribute accountability to hiring managers or business leaders about their expectations so that the lightning rod of blame doesn't come to just recruiting, right? If you don't hit these goals. And then to Chris's point, to your point, to Chris's point, I would manage as far in advance as possible. Like, what are you trying to do, right? And we're in Q4 right now. So that means people are trying to figure out, what am I trying to do for 2026? And that starts in January. And as people's budgets get locked up and, backfills go in for 2025, there's different stages of company as well. But as you plan for 2026, you have to start recruiting now. And if the budget's not approved till 2026 and that role's supposed to start in 2026, you're going to have a hiring manager who's mad that their role didn't start, blaming recruiting when it could be a business planning issue. If you can't tell thematically, the undertone of how I've done recruiting has been a balance between what is being asked of me and what I'm able to produce, and identifying all of the external inputs that might impact these results and trying to get in front of them, trying to manage those expectations. And so you brought up a good point about this Q1 front-loaded plans. I think that is a result of two things. One, it's not necessarily understanding the financial budget or having a process that might not get there. And then there's this like Q4 planning limbo, right? Where it's kind of like, all right, we're doing something and we have something coming up in the future. Now what do we do? And I presume that whether it was at Wayfair with some of the customers that you're serving now, you're managing this like little budget window that we're in and trying to figure out how to navigate the limbo of Q4. But I'd love to hear your experience. Like, what are you seeing now and how are companies handling it?
Yeah, and I think before I jump in, I just want to actually double click on something that you just said, and I'm going to try and avoid going to too much. I get very excited when we start talking about ops concepts. And so
Yeah.
we're not going to talk about internal arrival rate or Little's Law or anything like that I get super excited about. But one thing you said is the capacity of the non-recruiting areas and how that could actually hold up your recruiting funnel. I kind of like to think of it as, when you're on a flight, you go and land at the destination airport. Depending on how many planes have landed at the same time, your immigration queue could be 10 minutes or it could be 3 hours. And the same process happens when you're recruiting. If you have all the demand come in at once, then everyone's moving through the funnel at the same time. And so your funnel could go from nothing to a huge amount. This happens in campus because of the cyclical nature of actually when you can recruit. But it's not just the recruiter's time. You can actually plan for that quite effectively. And it's not just the hiring manager's time, which often you forget about. But if you can get a commitment and say, if you want to hire 100 people, this is how much time you're actually going to need to invest each week. And these are the kind of the slots that we're going to pre-reserve and free up if you don't need them. And one of the things that we hadn't anticipated previously is the actual just capacity to actually do the interviews. And you mentioned the challenge with AI, and there's a huge issue now with fake candidates. And so a lot of companies now are starting to say, well, let's move back in office for interviews. But one of the constraints you have there is how much conference room space do you have? And if you're trying to do interviews in Q4 when you've also got budget planning meetings and marketing reviews and maybe vendors visiting, like all of a sudden that kind of real estate fight becomes quite competitive. And if you're recruiting, actually booking out all the meeting rooms for interviews, one, you may not even have enough, even if you do that. So you're going to have to think of some creative solutions. And two, you're actually going to really frustrate all your existing employees. And I definitely saw that year after year. So actually having that kind of plan in place, and then thinking through not just the kind of like the first order and the second order impacts, but what else needs to happen in order for us to speed up time to hire, because if you slow down time to hire, your best candidates are going to get snapped up. And so I would just say speed solves a lot of problems as long as you have the right checks and balances in place. But if you exceed capacity in any one part of that, that's where you're going to get your bottleneck. And that's where the kind of ops theory comes in. And that's all I'm going to say about that for now, because I'm sure in a future podcast, we're going to get into the weeds, and I'm pretty excited about that.
Doing it, there's this context that we're trying to tell you is that the business is asking for something and you provide. And in that relationship of ask for it and provide, there's a quantification of what you can provide. And then there's context for how people ask. And so it's going to be different, right? We're getting as deep as conference room space and interview hours, et cetera, for high growth scale ups. But even if you're not growing at that rate, there's a context for how demand and capacity work. And I have this article on Headcount called Recruiting Capacity Like a Pro. It shows you this triangle. If you're a photography person, it's called the ISO triangle. And you basically have to say okay, I can produce, or I can do projects, or I can do experience. And so as you navigate the recruiting capacity, you're going to have all these inputs of well, what can I do? And what is the context for that? Then you're going to have demand from the business. And at the end of the day, the recruiting function is a service to the business that needs to fit into those things. So, you're going to have to create that context. But for new folks, it's setting your baseline targets around what can we produce versus what is being asked is that's kind of 101. As you get more advanced and you learn from more cycles of your business, you're going to learn what those those inputs are from the business. And you want to be able to track those inputs so that you have this context of okay, we can do that. Here are our limitations, and you're flagging them up front. 99% of recruiting promotions happen when you can understand that information and manage the expectation up so that you're not waiting until something's wrong before the problem is identified. And then for the advanced folks, you're going to get crazy inputs that you're going to have to then make models, and you're going to have to hold people accountable to these models. And once data gets, I love the immigration line analogy, right? If everything comes at once, the line can handle normal volume at an airport. And that's kind of what's interesting about recruiting. You get 40 backfills all of a sudden because interns fell out because some new thing happened. That's a way different amount of volume than 40 roles that happen across, over the year. So what other things do you think are important for folks at the end of if you're reporting, it's Q4 right now, which means we have 3 main things to do. We have to finish the 2025 plan. We have to report on how we did as context for what we think is possible for the future. And we have to plan for the 2026. What do you think recruiters or recruiting leaders should be doing today? Like, what data should they organize to, start planning for 2026? What should they bring to the table so that next year goes well?
Yeah, so in our Q4 QBR, so we would run a QBR with the CEO and the executive team. We would prepare all of the recruiting metrics, and there are a few things we'd look at. So you look at 2026 goals. At that point, you're going through the planning process, so you generally don't have them in place. But you say, in order to continue growing at the pace we're growing, this is the recruiting capacity we need. So I think just like a baseline understanding of that. So it becomes less of a kind of ticket processing function and more of a partnership where you're not just getting the recs thrown over the wall and expected to handle them, but you're actually coming to the table with some recommendations. And so you have that recruiting capacity. But then if you're in a data-driven business, which I don't know any businesses that aren't data-driven today, your exec team are going to push back and say, well, what does this mean in terms of time to hire? Like, what are you doing to improve time to hire? How is our quality of hire doing? What is our attrition rate? How does that break down between regrettable and non-regrettable? And how are we measuring that? How are we going to improve that over time? How are you driving down the cost of recruiting through software or outsourcing things that are not within the core competency of the recruiting team? And so there's kind of like a number of these kind of different metrics that you're going to need before you go into that meeting, just to really understand what your plan is. And I'd say the approach that I've seen work best is when the recruiting leader or the head of HR goes in with a plan and a recommendation that is grounded in data, and not just kind of going in with a kind of headcount plan and saying, we can't achieve this because we only have half the recruiting capacity that we need. And so it's kind of a two-way conversation. And I think you touched on that. It's not just a kind of a planning exercise where everyone creates their plan and then it goes up to someone and they make a decision. Like, it should be a negotiation, but in order to have that seat at the table, to really kind of have those discussions, you're going to need to have that data behind you. And I'd say if you don't have time to hire, cost per hire, quality of hire broken down by different funnels, different departments, different seniority levels, and then you're really going to struggle to actually on the fly adjust your expectations and kind of set them with the business and get that buy-in early on and say, if you want to hire this many people, this is the commitment we need from you for interviewer time, or this is the expected timeline before we're going to close those roles. And these are the reasons why, unless we do this and we, add a sourcing team, or we increase capacity by hiring more recruiters, or we outsource our executive recruiting because that's going to drain most of our time. So there's kind of all these kind of conversations, but it starts with the data. And if you don't have the data, you don't really have a say in the business decision there.
I think what I like as you're running through all those things, because I think you and I will say the same thing, and if our listeners go to an advisor, they're going to say the same thing. But like the main takeaway I have for recruiting leaders is establish credibility in saying no. So if if you don't have data that the business trusts, then you're using your word. So you're going to walk into a role with existing credibility based on the culture of your business. When you tell the business you don't have capacity and or the plan is unattainable, they need to understand it from their lens, not from your lens. It's not about what you think you could do or a guess on capacity. It should be about, what did we do? What is the actuals of a previous set of time, and why is this new set of data related? So for example, if you didn't fill 50 hires, but they were all these senior level, obscure, new to the business, light candidate pool hires, and then you have 50 interns the next thing, you say, well, we didn't hire 50 last time, and so we can't hire 50 this time, you're losing the credibility because there's this difficulty. Now, those are at two extremes, but the more finite you're able to get with this analysis, the more credibility you establish in saying no. And to be clear, it's not all about saying no. It's about being taken seriously in the conversation about either readjusting a forecast, like a revenue or a production forecast, because hiring won't keep up, and or getting resources because you understand the cost to the business of not hiring, and therefore when you propose your cost of adding more recruiting staff or finding a dedicated interviewer from the engineering team, right? You're establishing that the value of them doing that is worth more than the cost to the business. And that credibility, I think, at the beginning of the call, we talked a little bit about how sellers have Salesforce or CRM have Zendesk, et cetera. It's when they're asking for resources, when you add a new seller to a territory, it's about the cost of that seller versus the revenue relative to salary commission plus, and revenue. And so with recruiters, without it being very clear cut, especially with it being indirect revenue, right? So like a recruiter themselves produces revenue by hiring producers of revenue. So you need to establish those things up front. So like having that credibility, I think it's what both of us are trying to do with our respective solutions in the space, whether you're working with us in the software capacity or a consulting capacity, you're downloading unicorn stuff, you're on the recruiting analytics YouTube channel trying to learn something new. Like we are trying to, from our experience, like I said, I've had executive meetings at the beginning of my career where I blew it. And I now know why I blew it, and that's why we're having these conversations. So what advice do you have for folks entering this season, like beginner, intermediate, advanced? What do you think everyone should take away from this call or from your experience about what to be doing this planning season?
Yeah, I think if there was kind of one thing that I would really kind of caution people about is to not be surprised when you go into that planning meeting. And in order to do that, you need the data, and we've discussed that, but you also need to understand the business and what drivers the business are trying to push on. And I think every good TA leader that I've worked with has always been with their business partners, and whether it's the HR business partner or actually with the business unit leader themselves, to really understand their business. They sit in their all hands meetings. They have kind of like a weekly or a bi-weekly check-in, and they understand what are the considerations and actually feed into the process at that time. And so when the CEO turns around and says, well, we need to grow in EMEA and we're going to open a new office in Germany, the recruiting leader is not surprised and has already thought about that scenario. You can actually come up with very, very data-driven recommendations. It's going to build the credibility of that leader. And it's also going to make the plan more likely to work as well. So I think that kind of like sowing the seeds of the planning process early, which, if your planning cycle really starts in December, it's October now, you could be doing this next week and actually kind of building those plans, those different scenarios. And maybe you build 10 different scenarios and only 2 of them get discussed, but you're not kind of like left with a kind of an unknown going into that meeting. You actually already have that kind of like thought process in place. You can actually already solicit that around your leadership team and actually help understand a little bit more about what that would mean from their perspective. So I think that's one of the big ones. It took me a while to get out of my own silo because I felt like when I was first in the recruiting role, I was very heads down. I had my goal, but actually meeting on a weekly basis with the other recruiting leaders, with the business partners, and then with my kind of stakeholders within the business to understand what they were doing actually allowed us to collaboratively come up with a plan. And then it wasn't that the business was presenting the plan to the executive team and then the recruiting team were arguing against the plan. You were kind of presenting the plan together and you'd already thought it through. And it just meant that the plan was much more likely to get accepted. Yeah, if you could give one example, maybe one of the, and this is kind of more long-term thinking, but to build a business case for something that on the surface would probably get shot down. And so one of the core channels that we had for recruiting senior leaderships roles was going to McKinsey, Bain, BCG, and hiring consultants who'd had great experience, especially in the retail sector. So this is at Wayfair. And one of the things that we found is that we're actually drying up the amount of talent that was available because the company was growing so much and other retailers had seen this as a potential channel. And so we were kind of competing. And so our funnel was narrowing a little bit, but the demand was increasing. And so supply demand mismatch. And one of the things we started to think about was, well, how can we actually have a touch base with those folks earlier? And so we started to offer internships to people that we knew were not going to close and thought about this as a long-term investment. And so working with the business and understanding how many senior leaders they would need, 3 to 5 years from now, and kind of layering that into a kind of cost per hire analysis of, if we invest in this program now and actually bring these people in as interns, give them a really good experience, and then have a nurture campaign each year where we check in with them. As soon as they're ready to move, they're going to come straight to us, and we don't need to find them and close them. We already have that relationship built out. And actually putting that into a business case where you show the return on investment made that very clear. And all of a sudden we were running, fancy dinners with high potential candidates, knowing that 80% of them wouldn't close, but in 3 to 5 years, we were going to close them as senior hires and actually save, 50 to 100,000 in potential close costs because we'd invested this, a few $100s up front early on. So that's kind of like one example of where kind of working closely with the business, but not just on kind of immediate FY 2026 planning, but really thinking ahead of how do we actually solve these problems in the long term.
You brought up two things that I want to touch on quickly. So one is scenario planning, and two is the financial relationship. I would say my advice to TA leaders going into Q4 is start with everything's possible, right? Like, you want to hire 100 people in January? That's possible. You might need to acquire a company. It's possible. It might not be via recruiting, but you can do those things. I think it's, cheap, fast, reliable is the triangle of the cost of business, but you can go do anything. And, just like if you were building a house and you wanted the house built tomorrow, okay, it's possible. We might need to truck in one of those pre-built houses or a shipping container. You might need to buy a house that already exists. There's like a lot of different ways to do it, but you have these, it always makes sense when you have these tangible things where recruiting is a little less tangible. But the reason why you have these two things that are important to me is scenario planning is the way that you experiment with the business about these very possible outcomes in a way that incorporates in the cost and effort to achieve that outcome. So the internal recruiting team is one recruiting service a business has the option of using. They can use external recruiting teams, RPOs, they could acqui-hire, hiring manager-led hire. There's a lot of different ways. And so starting a scenario plan with like, what do we want? And yes, it is possible, allows you to then participate in the conversation with your finance team about what is it going to cost to do it? Because everyone in business just says, do more. Is usually the go-to. However, there are limitations to these capacity models. So, wrapping the whole podcast into kind of like one phrase or two, it's, your capacity demand, your customer inputs, you then use those during these scenario plans of what does the business want to then say, here are the possible solutions that we could take to go do it. And I think whether you're a beginner or advanced, whether you're in a stagnant company or a super scale up, the concept that the business wants something from a service and the service has many ways of providing it is the conversation of workforce planning. And not to go too deep into future topics that we'll cover here, is like you have existing employees who could do that job, you have new employees who you could hire to go do that job, and then you have the context of how fast you want it done, you have the ramp time, you have the of new employees to get to production, and you have the overall forecast that you're building for the business. So it's all interconnected. I think you and I both discovered at this, period of time that the headcount data is missing from this conversation. It's not necessarily, there's a lot of subjectivity in what we're in the recruiting conversation. I think the simplicity of funnel-based operations has a lot of folks thinking that they can just do it if they took it on for 2 weeks, like I'm sure you and I did at the beginning of our careers. But it's just one of those things where, the headcount data provides context about whether the scenarios you're mapping are possible, and it gives you real data about the cost of those inputs, whether it's a financial cost or a time cost, so that the business understands whether or not they can hit goals. And so, totally 30,000 foot view, totally abstract. The headcount data has information that could do it, and there's new information in this data lake. But that's kind of like, when I think of hearing you speak, this is why I wanted to do this podcast. So for anyone who doesn't know, Chris, I would look at your LinkedIn post. I'm like, wow, this guy gets it. But then I didn't realize that you were starting Meander, which is it's a provider in the services. So for those who don't know, I run Headcount 365. It's a software provider. So I thought we were competitors a little bit. I was like, oh, okay. Then I did the AI for TA, a podcast with Mike Brown. on Unicorn, and he's like, you have to talk to Chris. And then we got to know each other, and we're not competing. We're providing a similar service to different segments of the market. And so now you and I kind of have this like shared, we're doing the same thing. We're taking different paths to get there. We're serving different types of customers. But, listening to you speak about the topic kind of like invigorates me, and like, I get so excited about this one specific thing. And so, I'm just excited to learn from you through this podcast, and glad that we're able to be doing this.
I'm excited. Yeah, I'm excited to dig into some of the more advanced topics as well. And hopefully there's something for everyone in those. And I trust you to stop me if I wind up getting into the weeds too much. I get very excited talking about models.
The weeds is where we're going to go. So for those, if you've made it to the end of the podcast, thank you for listening the whole way through. We have 7 more episodes this season that we're going to release every week from now through the end of the year, holidays excluded or holiday seasons excluded here in the US. And so there's going to be something for everyone. We just kind of wanted to open with this. Let's establish a little credibility. Let's develop a vibe about 2 people who have come out of doing this work before, which is, for those of you who are in the HR tech space, it's very rare that folks who do the work create the software for many reasons, but it was awesome to find you and then open this up with you. So for those who are here and still listening, stay tuned. We have 7 more episodes to go. We'll leave a place, some links below about where to go to ask questions or to participate in the podcast. So if there's anything that you want to engage with us or ask or come on the podcast, we'll do it. But until then, stay tuned, and I'll let Chris close us out with some closing thought. What do you want everyone to take away from this conversation? What to expect from the Headcount podcast? What's your expectation? What do you want people to know? Closing thoughts with Chris.
Oh God, I didn't plan this, but based on what we've discussed, I think data is power. If you want to seat at the table, you need data, and hopefully we're going to help everyone figure out how to get the data and how to have that seat at the table. So I hope everyone finds it useful.
And you need more than like data. And people are always like, oh, why I have a spreadsheet? It's like, well, yeah, it exists in a spreadsheet as a snapshot. But if you want the history of that cell, you want the story of how that formula came to be, we got to talk. The snapshots over time create the real story. And that's what you and I are both providing. So awesome to engage on this first one. I think we got a whole host of information coming this quarter. So thank you everyone for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the Headcount Experts.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.